Everyone. How's everyone doing today? Monday morning? Well, if you're an AFC type of person, not a good weekend. But look, good morning, and thank you for being here. I'm Maryland's Attorney General Anthony Brown. Today is really more of a extended press availability than I'd say a press conference. Most of what I'm about to speak to has been reported on and is in the public domain. But I want to thank you for being here, and let me be clear. Chaos is coming from Washington, and it's putting Marylanders and Americans at risk. And we here in the Office of the Attorney General will not stand for that. A federal judge blocked Trump administration officials, including Elon Musk's allies, from accessing sensitive Treasury records. Why? Because their reckless, politically motivated actions are jeopardizing the security of Americans' financial data and federal benefits. This is just the latest in a string of judicial interventions to stop President Trump's dangerous overreach, from freezing federal funds to dismantling critical agencies like USAID. The courts see it for what it is, an abuse of power, and so do we. 3 weeks ago, the administration tried to freeze federal spending. The results, again, chaos. Parents feared they'd lose access to the food they need to feed their infant children. Families reliant on federal assistance worried they'd be evicted. Schools and early childhood education programs faced uncertainty. Our office, along with 22 other states' attorneys general, sued immediately. We won an early victory when a federal judge issued a temporary restraining order blocking the freeze. This prevented untold hardship with Marylanders. The administration tried to backtrack, but their intentions remain clear. They'll keep looking for ways to cut critical funding. And as of Friday, we continue to hear examples after examples, including the EPA still continuing to freeze funds and make their access unavailable. So we won't let them. Freezing funds isn't enough for this administration. Now they're going after the Treasury, the U.S. government's central payment system. The Treasury Department manages Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, federal benefits, child care tax credits, and a lifeline for millions. Till recently, only vetted officials, those who have undergone rigorous scrutiny, career public servants, could access the sensitive financial data. Then on February 2nd, the president handed the keys to Elon Musk and his so-called Department of Government Efficiency. People with no experience could bring no more efficiency as they purport to do so. This is a direct attack on the financial system that Marylanders and Americans rely on. Tens of billions of dollars are at stake right here in Maryland. Last year alone, Maryland received $11 billion in federal disbursements. Marylanders themselves, over $50 billion in federal aid through this system. We sued alongside 18 other states, and just days ago, a federal judge ruled in our favor, blocking Musk's allies from accessing Treasury's most sensitive financial systems. This was a critical win in stopping reckless mismanagement and protecting Americans' financial security. And just recently, President Trump's draconian decision to slash NIH grant funding for research institutions is a direct threat to the future of American higher education and global leadership in research. Maryland is home to some of the most prolific public and private research institutions that will suffer from this drastic action. The NIH has capped certain funding for grants that include vital resources for overhead and administrative costs. This move will cripple essential research operations at universities, including those in Maryland. Institutions like the University of Maryland College Park, University of Maryland Baltimore, Johns Hopkins will be forced to fill the gap, risking jobs and halting vital research. The funding loss will devastate lab operations, delay breakthroughs, and harm the United States' global leadership in biomedical research. This is harmful. It's an indiscriminate cut that undermines critical medical advances, including the important work done here in Maryland on cancer research. I am working alongside my multi-state partners, other attorneys generals. We're working with urgency on an appropriate action to come. This administration's misleading effort to shrink the federal workforce and further disrupt services will likewise hurt all of us. The unreliable buyout that we've heard about to federal workers is a scheme to destabilize the workforce and harm these employees. A federal judge paused the deadline until today, when the court will decide on the legality of the offer. I've joined a coalition of attorneys general to challenge these deceptive offers, and we filed our brief yesterday. We've urged federal workers who are considering this misleading offer to consult with your union representatives. The buyout promises pay and benefits, but workers may still be forced to work with a looming federal shutdown, perhaps in March, and the discontinuation of federal funds. They may not have the pay and the benefits that they've been promised, and they will also face restriction on outside jobs. President Trump isn't just targeting financial resources and federal workers. He's targeting some of the most vulnerable people in our community. At the end of January, the president announced new restrictions on gender-affirming care. Here in Maryland, a group of courageous transgender children and their families are fighting back with a lawsuit. We're not part of that case, but we support them, and I'm considering options for Maryland filing or joining a lawsuit. Let me say this loud and clear. These are children. These are our children. Children deserve love, care, and the right to live as their true selves. Executive orders like this strip transgender people of their humanity. They send a message that the president doesn't see them. Worse, they inject politics into deeply personal medical decisions. The president should stay in the Oval Office and not in your doctor's office. Two transgender Marylanders and their families, you belong, you matter, and we will defend your rights. So my job as Attorney General is to uphold the law, no matter who breaks it. Whether it's an individual or the federal government, will hold them accountable. These actions and our response are not about President Trump. They're about the harmful and insidious actions that President Trump has taken. We've already won key victories in court, blocking reckless funding freezes, protecting sensitive federal data from misuse, stopping the president's frenzied effort to eliminate birthright citizenship. But the fight is far from over. Many of these victories are temporary as we continue to litigate these cases, and we will do just that. We will fight in court, we will advocate, and we will continue to educate Marylanders of their rights and privileges. And we'll do whatever it takes to protect Marylanders. And with that, I'll take your questions.
Could you go back to, you said you were considering options on challenging the gender-affirming care actions. Can you kind of describe a little bit what you're thinking there?
Sure. I mean, when you look at the complaint filed in the state of Washington, there are two sort of things that they're looking at that we're considering as well, right? And that is the threat that federal funding would be discontinued to those institutions that are providing gender-affirming care. We think that that is unlawful. It's impermissible, and the manner in which the administration has gone about doing that can and should be challenged, and that's what they're doing in Washington State. Also, there are threats to providers of gender-affirming care that amount to threats of criminal prosecution. In Maryland, we regulate the practice of medicine. We invest a lot of time working with the medical community and establishing standards of care, and the notion that providing gender-affirming care somehow violates federal law that does protect people against mutilation and the inappropriate, illegal practice of medicine, that doesn't apply to gender-affirming care. So these are two areas that we're looking at, and again, based on our evaluation, I am considering when and where Maryland would bring or join an action.
Attorney General, you used the words harmful and insidious when discussing this administration's practices. We've seen talking points on the internet from the administration about maybe not honoring judicial decisions. It seems like there's a lack of regard for checks and balances that the three branches of government provides. Are we entering, or have we already entered into a constitutional crisis? Do you think that there's more to see, or are we at the tipping point of how, I guess, aggressively this administration will move?
I would certainly say that the president does not value, does not honor the system of government established and followed for centuries in this country, the checks and balances, the separation of power, recognizing that Congress has the power to appropriate and that as president he has a responsibility to spend those dollars in a manner that Congress deems necessary and appropriate. That is lawless behavior, which is what brings us in court in Rhode Island with our colleagues to ensure that the monies appropriated by Congress go to their intended beneficiaries. Would I adopt or embrace your characterization that we are at a constitutional crisis? I do think that America's democracy is strong and it is being tested. And certainly as the Attorney General, I know what my assignment is. I know what my responsibility is. We live in a country of federalism where states advance and protect certain rights, and those are rights that need to be protected again, whether they are infringed upon by an individual or our own federal government. So we go to the courts for protection. And I am confident that the courts, after evaluating the facts and the law, are going to find that this is an administration that is acting above and beyond the rule of law. And I have confidence in what the courts will do.
You mentioned working on an action to come related to caps on NIH funding. Can you speak more about what it is that you guys are planning to file?
Sure. Well, look, what we know is that in Maryland, there are a number of research institutions that are, global leaders, right? On the public side, I mentioned University of Maryland College Park and the University of Maryland Baltimore. On the private side, Johns Hopkins, which may receive more federal, research grant dollars than any other institution. How much of that comes out of NIH, I don't know. But we're talking about tens of millions of dollars that would be blocked. That would undercut the ability to do this important research. Much of it is life-saving. In addition to the life-saving nature of the research and search for cures, it creates many jobs, and it sustains the research capacity that we have here in Maryland. So as we evaluate the impact on the caps on this grant, and as I confer with my colleagues in this multi-state coalition of attorneys general, as we determine that an action can and should be brought, then we will. So right now we evaluate this as we are evaluating every action that is coming out of Washington.
Okay, so there's not one that you're not 100% certain that there will be an action on that. You're considering options.
We're considering options, absolutely. Yes.
Dealing with the buyout, what exactly are you hoping the judge will rule today? And do you see or foresee that this is the way that this is going to be for the next 4 years in terms of what you're going to have to do in terms of constantly going to court?
Sure. So it's our hope that the judge will continue the suspending this buyout program. There are serious questions as to whether the president even has the authority to offer such a buyout. There are real risks to federal employees. As I mentioned, right now the federal government is funded through March, and there's no telling what federal funding will be continued, either in a continuing resolution or a remainder of the year appropriations. The terms of this so-called buyout are uncertain. So what we warn and caution federal workers to do, I don't advise them, I do caution them, I do recommend that they consult union representatives who have a intricate understanding of federal personnel law and whether or not these benefits are real or not. And from everything we can see, It is a false promise for these workers. As to your second question, is this what I foresee? What I've seen in the last 3 weeks? Is that your question? It seems like every day of the last 3 weeks, and not just Monday through Friday, but every day in the last 3 weeks, it's waking up almost to the experience you have when you wake up to a natural disaster or some other crisis. This sense of urgency, this need to act, but the most troubling aspect of it is that natural disasters are rarely, if ever, avoidable. Many of the crises, the public safety crises that we experience in communities in Maryland and around the country are not foreseen, and perhaps they could be avoided. And here we have a federal government that seems to be at war with the people of America, and it seems to be at war with communities across America. So we wake up every day to what feels like a crisis that requires urgent action, and I'm grateful for my fellow attorneys general to be able to collaborate with them on a common purpose, to protect the residents of our states and to do our share, our assignment in protecting the rights and the privileges of the people we serve.
So over the past couple of weeks, as these things have happened and I've sort of posted your responses to them, there's always a lot of comments, right? A lot of comments come in saying, that's not his role, the people elected the president. Why is this your role?
Look, let me say this to the people of Maryland who wonder what the role of the Attorney General is. My role is to protect the rights and the privileges of Marylanders. And I also recognize that there are many actions that come out of Washington where it is appropriate, more appropriate for others to act. And that's why we see lawsuits being filed against this administration by a number of non-governmental organizations, whether it's labor unions, whether it's democracy-oriented and reform-oriented organizations that are rightfully challenging these illegal actions by the Trump administration. But when we in the Office of the Attorney General evaluate and assess the threat coming from Washington, and we can draw a direct link to the rights and the privileges and the interests of Marylanders. Marylanders have an interest in NIH funding at the levels that they have been up until this weekend, for that funding to continue. It's going to save lives in Maryland. It will create jobs in Maryland. It will ensure that Maryland continues to be a leader when it comes to research. That is being threatened today. Marylanders who have in our economy one of the workforces, one of the highest percentages of federal workers, when the president threatens federal workers, that's a direct attack, not only to the men and women who are public servants and faithfully serve our country, providing services to the American people, but it is an assault on the economy of Maryland. It will have an impact on things like tax revenues and unemployment insurance and the ability of state government to deliver services when our important partner, the federal government, abandons that mission. So there is a role, and on every action that the Maryland Attorney General is joining or commencing, you can be assured that I will be able to draw a direct link between the rights, privileges, and interests of Marylanders and the action that we're taking against this administration.
So Vice President and Elon Musk now have come out with this notion that the judges shouldn't interfere with the actions of the president. To that you say?
Look, and they also used a fairly, sort of misplaced analogy to generals on the battlefield, and I served in the United States Army. I served as a judge advocate general, and I can tell you right now, there wasn't a single general that went into battle that didn't have their judge advocate general, their Army lawyer at their side, advising them on the do's and don'ts. Even in warfare, there are do's and don'ts. So this notion that generals or judges should be, or that generals and therefore the president should act, without any guardrails or restrictions, that's simply equivalent to taking the U.S. Constitution and burning it up and throwing it out, because that is not what was contemplated by our founders. Judges have an important role, right? The president needs to execute the laws, right? Congress needs to write the laws, and our courts, their responsibility is to interpret the laws. And when they interpret the laws in a way that when they evaluate the conduct of the president, he is acting lawlessly, as he is, probably the clearest example, and it's been articulated by a number of judges since January 20th, his sort of unilateral effort to eliminate birthright citizenship in this country. That has been a well-established law coming out of the Supreme Court in the late 1800s, and even before the Supreme Court's decision in the 1800s, a lot of common law supported that. So the judges, the courts have a role to play in this, in our system of government.
One more. Can you quantify the harm that you believe is?
Well, let's go one follow-up, then we'll come down here, and then we'll work our way around the room.
Can you just quantify the harm you think is being done to Marylanders, has been done by Marylanders? Some of it's been blocked, but quantify the harm you think this first 3 weeks has done.
I mean, it's difficult to quantify, and that's what litigation is, right? I mean, every day we're learning more about the harm and the damages. You know, when it comes to, I'll just use one example, on the NIH cap on grants. You know, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars at the University of Maryland, College Park, the University of Maryland, Baltimore, Baltimore alone. You know, tens of millions of dollars. But when you talk about freezing, okay, federal funds, we're talking across the board. We're talking about dollars that flow to EPA and Veterans Affairs. We're talking about dollars that flow to the Department of Labor. It's a lot of money, but it's more than the money, right? It's the impact on livelihoods. It's the impact on families. It's the impact on those populations that rely a great deal on public services. And they're not just in states like Maryland that, you know, could be, you know, characterized as a blue state. Right, the harm, the damage that is being done is being felt in every state across these United States. So it's part of what we do in litigation is to quantify that damages, and we will do that as we are developing these cases. But the harm is already apparent to us. Come down here, and then we'll see what we've got over here.
All right, so two questions. One, there are certain threats that the president has made regarding funding losses to states that haven't yet been acted on. So, for example, time, transportation funding to factors like marriage rates and birth rates, and penalizing sanctuary cities, both of which potentially could affect funding here in Maryland. Is your office preparing, kind of in anticipation of those threats being acted on, potential actions before they've even taken place? And the second question is regarding the costs of all of these legal actions you've taken against the Trump administration in the last few weeks. Do you have a sense as to how much these lawsuits are actually costing so far?
Good, and remember that second question, because when I finish answering your first, you're going to want to remind me of that second one, although, yeah. So in terms of whether it's the transportation funding or any other funding, you know, I spent 6 years in Congress, and when Congress appropriates money, it more often than not does it with a set of criteria, a funding formula that has to be followed. And if the president thinks that he can come in and just with the stroke of his pen change those funding formulas, then he is going to be confronted with a challenge, I can imagine, from Maryland and other states, okay, that are going to challenge that, those alterations to funding formulas. States, every state, relies on transportation funding to deliver, whether it's mass transit, roads, bridges, whether it's new starts, or whether it's maintenance. We all rely on that, and we rely on a predictable set of factors and criteria and formula. And sometimes those formulas are changed, and more often than not, it's either through Congress or through some deliberative process that follows the law. So I can't stand here today and tell you that I am drafting a complaint to challenge that. We're going to evaluate and assess the impact that has. You know, the things generally that we look at is the president following the law? We all acknowledge that the president of the United States has enormous powers. They're not unlimited, okay? So is he acting within those powers, and is he following the law in using that power? And we're seeing a violation on both grounds. In terms of the cost of litigation in Maryland, right? You know, I've got a federal accountability unit. I've worked with the governor and the Department of Budget and Management to bring on a unit of professionals, lawyers and non-professionals, and some of you have already reported on it. It's six people, and they are within, you know, the state budget. We put the number out there. I think it's, you know, costs and everything probably be, I don't know, 1.2, 1.3 million. We can get you the exact number. But this notion that the state is involved in this exorbitant litigation, I think is misplaced and doesn't accurately reflect what we're doing. But I think even more importantly, it's the cost of inaction. Just on the NIH grant cap alone, if we did nothing, that would cost us tens of millions of dollars. So when we look at the number of actions, freezing of federal funding, the potential impacts of Elon Musk and his crew, who are commandeering and hijacking the central payment system, every day that they were to block funds, okay, that's a major cost to the people of Maryland, some of which will never be recovered. So it's a small investment for what we hope will be an important result for the people of Maryland.
But so you're not able to parcel out how much has, I understand that there's a budget for the office that takes on these lawsuits, but are you able to account for just the amount that has been spent on these specific, the last 3 weeks of litigation against the Trump administration, or is it not?
So in addition to the personnel that I mentioned, right? Yeah, because right now I've got people I'm bringing to a federal accountability unit. They're on the state payroll, right? And they'll be on the state payroll for a long time. In terms of the litigation itself, they're court filing fees, right? We're not involved in major discovery at this point. We haven't brought in expert witnesses and the like, right? So the costs right now of litigation are de minimis.
Mr. Attorney General, who or what entity is responsible for guarding the Treasury Department computers while the restraining order is placed, and what are the consequences for violating that?
So the consequences, certainly if we see that there is a violation of a court order, we're going to go to the court and ask for relief. And then the enforcement will be the means in which courts enforce the order. Look, this is the troubling aspect, is that you have, right, what the fox guarding the hen house, is that an expression? Run something like that. But the order was very clear. Elon Musk and his team stays out of the central payment system. Whatever information they've already obtained needs to be destroyed, and certainly will be vigilant to ensure that the court's orders are followed. We do not have in the Office of the Attorney General, nor my coalition of state attorney generals, an enforcement arm, right? So we look to the courts and the mechanism that courts use to enforce orders.
And a follow-up to that, so many of these right now are temporary restraining orders. They just happened, if they're getting the process going. What is the confidence of your coalition that you could permanently block these actions?
Right, and I don't want to put out any sort of false expectations, right? I think the language that we've seen in the orders are pretty strong about and this is true whether it's birthright citizenship, whether it's a federal freeze, whether it's in those two actions particularly. The language is pretty strong that that there would be irreparable harm to the states if the order wasn't put in place, and that's one of the standards for a temporary restraining order, which they're in place anywhere from 14 to 28 days. So as we near the end of February, if not before, we'll be seeking preliminary injunctions to stay these actions pending litigation. I would not want to forecast and give any false hope in terms of what the likelihood of the outcome might be. But we feel as if we've got strong cases to make. We think that the law is on our side, and we think that the facts, as they are revealed, demonstrate that this president, this administration is acting lawlessly.
Are you throwing any precedent from Trump's first term? I know you weren't the Attorney General at the time, but do you see any comparisons from the lawsuits filed from his first term to now there's more severity in this term? And kind of going off of that, is that $1 million request for the legal team going to be enough, again, with the severity and the amount of lawsuits that are coming in just the last 3 weeks?
In preparation for January 20th, certainly had an opportunity to review the first Trump administration, to see the types of actions that they brought, so that we can do our due diligence and anticipate and plan for as best we could what to expect in the second Trump administration. We know that Project 2025, drafted, crafted by his running mates, his running partners, I'll say, right? And I'm sure his running mate and now vice president had a hand in that as well, although I don't know that for certain, but he certainly embraces it today. Looking at Project 2025 gave us a sense of their roadmap, and we're seeing all of it play out as we have in the last 3 weeks. The volume, I'll let others comment on the volume. I was not in this position as Attorney General 8 years ago. I was on Capitol Hill, but it's my sense that the volume is much greater. The rate at which these very harmful executive orders and directives are being issued probably exceeds the rate that we saw 8 years ago. Let me see if I can clarify, because there are two questions about cost, right? And I know, look, I think it's responsible to ask, hey, what does state government pay for all the services that we provide to people? I've got I don't know, Christian, help me out. What general funds, special funds? What's the budget of the Office of the Attorney General? $60-something million. Right. So I've got, between special funds and general funds, I got about a $60 million budget. So I've added about 1.2 to that budget. So do the math. It's, what is it? It's somewhere between 1 and 2%, right? 1.2% of my budget is for the team that is going to not just litigate, right, but really look at the entire federal accountability. There's going to be rulemaking down the road where we're going to comment on that. There's going to be all sorts of things. I've got a team that constitutes a little bit more than 1% of my budget that is looking at that. This is a team that essentially has the frontline responsibility in my office to implement the Maryland Defense Act that was passed in 2017. This is what gave the Office of the Attorney General the authority to protect Marylanders when threatened by the federal government. Okay? Beyond that 1.2% of my budget, this idea that it's going to be very costly litigation, this is one of the benefits of working in collaboration with attorneys general around the country. And this is not new in the area of federal litigation against an administration, right? We do this in opioid litigation. We do this in lawsuits we bring against social media platforms. We're involved in multi-state coalitions on a regular basis to pool resources, expertise, and the like. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that. Anyone else?
One final one. It's the same sort of question I asked before, but
you're going to ask in a different way to get a different answer.
Potentially. I also wanted to ask you about immigration. But this notion that the president's doing exactly what he said he was going to do, right? And they continue, members of Congress, you're there, continue to say, look, he's doing what he said he was going to do. There's a greater good here. It's going to cause some pain in the short term, but in the long term, it's the right, the right things to do. What do you say to that argument?
So, and you were about to get to immigration, so I'm going to get there before you do,
yeah,
right?
So immigration, ICE continues to criticize Prince George's County for not honoring detainers. What should they be doing? That's the next one.
So, look, and I think they're connected. To answer your first question, we can talk about immigration, right? So the president ran on a platform that he was going to remove undocumented immigrants from our country, and there are estimates say maybe 11 million plus undocumented immigrants. He has now encountered the reality that where he needs to focus is on violent criminals. And that's true whether they're documented or undocumented. But to the extent that he's focusing on the immigrant community, and he's focusing on the undocumented immigrants, and he's focusing on the most violent, he's not getting a whole lot of pushback from anybody, nor should he, because we want to make sure that we identify people in our communities, regardless of immigration status, okay, so that we can take them off our streets. Okay, but when you come out of the gate and you send a message to the immigrant community, such as saying we are going to eliminate birthright citizenship, he clearly needs to understand, and if he doesn't, then it's because he doesn't have people around him who are knowledgeable and informed about the history of our country and the law. He leads with an executive order to eliminate birthright citizenship. All that is a message to the immigrant community, the undocumented immigrant community, that we don't care about you, whether you are a violent offender or not. So words matter, and if he focused on actions that a country could coalesce around, and less on the inflammatory language that he often speaks to appeal to a certain constituency, he'd be a little bit better off than he is today. So that's the concern. In terms of, I won't speak necessarily about Prince George County's decision to do what they do, but as you know, we put out guidance to state and local law enforcement, which has been misrepresented by some in the news, not by the news, but by some speaking to the news, that it's somehow a recommendation from the Office of the Attorney General. It's not. We do our job, and that is to help state and local law enforcement understand what their requirements are under state law. And Maryland General Assembly has passed a number of laws that have put restrictions on what state and local law enforcement can do in terms of asking for information about immigration status, about sharing information about someone's personal information, including immigration status. We outlined that under Maryland law, there are limits on how long you can detain someone under Maryland law or run the risk of legal action against you as an officer and your department. So that's our job. Our job is to provide the guidance to local and state law enforcement on what state law requires and what federal law requires. It has been characterized as a plan by the Attorney General to stall or impede cooperation between the state and federal government. And that's hardly the case. We're interpreting the law. There are things that you can and cannot do under state law, and there are things that you are required and not required to do under federal law.
I have a question not related to Trump, but to the PFAS lawsuit
Mhm.
investigation. Do you have a sense of what Maryland will seek in damages?
There's a lot of harm to Maryland, as you can imagine, right? So we continue to test and evaluate the impact on soil and groundwater in countless locations around the state. So as I stand here today, I cannot quantify what that damage is. But I can tell you that the components of our damage claim, right, is certainly to remediate the harm that's been done, to abate the cost of abatement to prevent future harm, and then to the extent that there's been, and we suspect that there has been, harm to people and communities, then we'll seek recovery in that regard as well. So it's likely a very large number. Anybody else? Great. Hey, thanks. Have a wonderful day.